Right, I've come down today to discuss the evacuees that came in Rudyard and surrounding area and the effect it had on the lives of evacuees and the lives of the people that they were living among. It's 80 years since they first came. They varied from age 5 to 10 or 11, so at least 4 that are living today, but there's a little story with each one. So I'll just at what we've got. You've got 10 shilling per week if you took one, and if you took 2 you got an extra 8 shilling, which is 50 pence and 40 pence, but 10 shilling a week then would keep a child in food. They came by train up from Bethnal Green, and there was a good train load. It must have been a terrific operation to get these children out in the countryside, but the last drop-off was Rudyard, and they brought them up to the pavilion, the bowling pavilion at Station Hotel, and invited people to go down and select a child, which is more or less, it must have felt like an auction to the children standing there being picked. But anyway, my mother went down and said, well, I've got 2 boys and a girl, so I'll have a girl. So she picked this girl up. She was 10 years old. Her name was Mary Lemmy. It's L-A-M-E-Y, but it's pronounced Lemmy. And of course she brought it back and she settled down. She was a nice, friendly girl. But she hadn't been with us many months when my father had a fatal accident. And my mother was a widow at 30 with 3 young children. And she says to my mother, you won't want me now. And my mother said, of course I want you. And she said, you're one of the family. So she did, she stayed. She was quite helpful, around the house and everything, really very cheery soul. And she'd a brother, Ronnie, but he'd landed at Bradnap, and she'd never seen him for, 18 months. So my grandfather had got a bit of petrol for running about, farmers did, about a gallon a week. So he took us over and she took her to see Ronnie, and he was the same age as me. And she was delighted. It was funny, she was so close and yet never seen him for so long. But anyway, about a couple of years later, she had a brother, older. He was too old to come back. He was 14 when she came. But when he was 16, she had the tragic news that he'd died of a brain hemorrhage. At half term, I remember she went potato picking for my grandfather. And I remember her coming back with a 10 shilling note waving in the air, first money she'd ever earned. Then, as I say, I went to the Mountside School, which is Leakeye now, and of course Ronnie was in the same class, and I got to know him quite well. In 1944, Mary had to go back, she was 14, but she came back every year for a fortnight's holiday until she got married in 1950. And then she always kept in touch with my mother. And then she wrote one time, Ronnie got in the Navy to do his national service. And she says, right, I'm worried about Ronnie, he's gone thin. Anyway, it wasn't long before he died. He got 22. So she'd lost 2 brothers. But she'd married and she had a very good. My mother went down to her son's wedding and kept in touch with her for 62 years. And when my mother died, she sent a beautiful floral tribute to my other mother. So that was Mary. Anyway, we move on to Bill Badham. He came from Bethnal Green. He'd never seen a green field or a farm animal in his life. And he was finished up at Pheasant's Clough Farm in Meerbrook. And he settled in very well for 4 years. And when he was 14, he went back to Bethnal Green. And he took a job for 2 years and he couldn't settle. So he wrote back to the Robinson family. Could he come back? They says yes. So he came back, carried on with the farm, met a local girl and joined the young farmers. Then they started off on a small holding. He'd been chairman of the young farmers, and then in 1964 he moved to Evacuees. They bought a larger farm, and he became chairman of Evacuees National Farmers Union. He came back to Meerbrook every year when they had the church fete. He never lost his London accent. He was the only farmer I could ever talk to. And I last saw him about 3 years ago. He came up to a 90th birthday of a friend, and I sat talking to him, and that was the last time I saw him. He wasn't very well. He passed away 2 years ago. But it was a remarkable story of a man that had never seen anything, and he became a very good farmer. And his family have carried on. They carried on farming, so he's left his legacy. And then there was a Rains family. There was 3 children. There was Babs, Terry and Bunty. And my grandmother took them in. They were from Manchester. Well, my grandmother was about 70 then. And to take 3 children on and run the farmhouse and one thing and another, it was a bit much. So after about 6 or 9 months, there was a couple at Beat Lane, Rushton, Mr. and Mrs. Tom Mallett. They had no children, they were on a small holding, so they says, oh well, we'll take them in. So they took them in for the duration of the war. But he called on me, what Bunty did. He got a travelling job in the 1980s, about 40 years later. He just called on me and we had a chat, and then that's the last I saw him. And then going across the village, there was 2 young fair-haired girls called Sylvia Orton, O-R-T-O-N, Orton without the H, and Doreen Hayes. They were cousins, but you might have thought they were sisters, slim blonde girls. And of course they went to all the school with me, and they was with the station master. He didn't live in the station house, he lived in one of those big semis up at the lake, but they stayed with him till he retired, and then he went to Leek, and they moved to Leek with him, and I lost touch with them. But in later years, she must have stayed, and she married a chap named Norman Wood, and I think they had about 6 children. He was a local councillor, and he came mayor of Leek. And she came mayoress of Leek, and that was when I got the reconnection, because it said his wife Sylvia was an evacuee from Rudyard. So I saw a photograph in the Leek Post of something civic, and I could recognise her, although she was a lot older. And then he died rather young. I don't think he was above late 50s. And then she carried on living up the Bawley Green area, but I got to know her son, David, and I was in the co-op, it would be in the 90s, 20 years ago, and I saw him, and I saw this lady with him, and I knew who it was, but she wasn't slim and blonde. No disrespect, she was plump and grey. But I went across and had a chat, and she was delighted to see me. She remembered me. But anyway, she passed away a couple of years ago. But then there was the evacuee as came, which was Ernest, who came here for a very short time to a Mrs. Graham. But 80 years after he first came, he came back to the Lake Hotel. And Ray invited me to come down, and we sat for a good hour and a half, reminiscing. And I'd never met him while he was here, but I believe he was attracted to the lake because when he was here, the lady used to turn him out in the morning, didn't want to see him till tea time, so they used to come down the lake and the railway. And then the Farmer's Guardian did an article on a evacuee called George Gilbert. He wasn't a man I met, but he came when he was 8. And he was on this farm on the Staffordshire-Shropshire border, and it was a dairy farm. And in the wartime, there was a body formed called the War Agricultural Association, and they got power to go around farms and tell them to plough land up to grow corn or green crop or whatever. But he remembers this war ag man coming and telling the farmer, you'll have to grow some potatoes. Well, in 1942, the end of the winter, we'd only 2 weeks' supply of potatoes left in the old country. So they got round what farms could grow potatoes, and they said to this farmer, he says, I'm a dairy farmer, he says, well, if you don't grow potatoes, we shall evict you, and we shall put somebody in as will grow them. So we had to grow 5 acres of potatoes, which my grandfather used to do. So now we come along to Betty Johnston. Now she came when she was 5, she was the youngest one of all, and she stayed with that little cottage at the end there, Paddy Price and Gladys, they had no children. So she stayed there, and I remember her at school as a young girl, and then when she was 10, when the war ended, and she was thinking of going back, but they weren't in touch. What had happened was, her father was in the services and he'd lost his life. The house had been bombed and flattened. Her mother was in sheltered accommodation, couldn't look after her. So she stayed, and she stayed on, and then she made friends because she joined things in the village. She was in the pantomime, first as a fairy and then a chorus girl, and she made friends with a girl from Birch Tree's farm. There was a Stedman family that were there, and they got a girl, Hilda, she was same age. And they were friends, and they went to Leek School together, and they were friends right through. And they were both in as chorus girls, and then the Stedman family left Birch Trees and went further away farming. So they sort of lost touch there, but Betty stayed. And then she got married to a chap called Ellis in Thomas Street. So she became Betty Ellis. The last time she was in the pantomime was about 1954, and she was Betty Ellis. She got married when she was about 18, 19. And then time went by, and then in the 80s, my wife and I went to Llandudno, and someone said, oh, if you want to go to the White Lodge. Mrs. Beardmore said, they're very, very good. So we said, right, we went to the White Lodge, and there Mrs. Beardmore was Hilda Stedman. Of all the things. I recognised her straight away because she had curly red hair, and she was in the early 50s then. Of course, we went from time, and they moved to a larger one. It's the Kensington, a 50-bedroom one. They moved to that, and we kept going 2 or 3 times a year, and she kept saying to me, have you heard of Betty Johnston? I said, no, I'm not doing anything. She just disappeared. And anyway, when I come to, we did the video, the DVD, you know, her niece said her auntie was in Australia, didn't she? And again, of course this auntie was Betty Johnston. She'd been in Australia since 1956, this was 2016. So the next time I went to Llandudno, because Hilda's retired now, her son runs it, but she comes down every day, just check everything. And I said, you know, I've got some news for you. She says, well, I says, Betty Johnston. Where is she? I says, in Australia. So anyway, next time I went, I says, she said, I'll get in touch, you see. Anyway, I told her name was Betty Ellis. And she searched it out, and she says, we're talking online. She's in a wheelchair. And wasn't that a remarkable story? How that all came together. That I found Hilda Stedman by chance, and we found Betty Johnston by chance, as you might say. But anyway, then there was another evacuee, Joan Shrub. She stayed with the water bailiff, Mr. Brassington. And she stayed there. She was a quiet, rather plain girl. She never bothered with any boyfriends. She stayed with till Mr. Brassington died, and then she moved to Rushton to his brother on a small holding and kept house for him till he retired, and then they moved into a bungalow at Rushton. And then when he died, she moved to Macclesfield, and that was in the 90s, and I've never heard since what happened to her, but there was a young girl named Margot Tweddle. You know, the name sort of fascinated us, but she was a little shy girl with glasses, and you almost felt sorry for her. She didn't make many friends, and she lived with the Magniers. You go across the kissing gate and up the steps, the first bungalow, and she was there for several years until I don't know what happened to her. She didn't stay the end of the war. I felt she didn't seem to settle in like some of the evacuees. You know, they took it in the stride, because it must have been obviously a traumatic thing to come away from your parents, and Rudyard, a different culture than Bethnal Green, you can well imagine. But then we come along to Tommy Stone's shop, and there was this young girl, Barbara, that she made a home there, and Mr. and Mrs. Stone were very happy to have her, and I remember going in when I was about 8 and 9, and she'd be about 12, and she'd serve in the shop for him, you know. And I didn't see any much more of her, and that was that. She was there when Mrs. Stone died, and then his niece came. She was a spinster, about 40 years old, and she came to look after Mrs. Stone, and then she'd gone back to where she came from, Barbara, and eventually she got married, and then she emigrated to Nelson in New Zealand. But she kept in touch with Miss Stone. Now Alice Stone, a very nice lady. They used to have a whist drive every week at the Institute, and she always loved a game of whist, and she run the shop. And then in the early 80s she got dementia, and the children were going in and helping themselves, and she couldn't realise what was going on, so they had to close it. She closed it, and then she went into a home. Eventually, the rest of the family, she got some nieces she had and nephews, they sold the bungalow and it was demolished, and there's the two new ones there. One has got the name Kingswood, if you look above the front door. And what it was, she kept writing, Barbara did, and getting no reply, so she wrote to the Sentinel in the late 80s, and she'd sent a couple of she friendly with from Stoke-on-Trent, and they said, oh, the bungalow had gone. And so she then wrote to the Sentinel herself with a picture. Does anybody recognise what's happened? So of course I knew what had happened, so I wrote to her, and she wrote a lovely letter back and said, you've told me exactly all I need to know. And then she sent me a Christmas card letter, so I sent one back, and she kept sending me little bits of photographs, and I sent her a DVD, and she was absolutely sent me a long letter, because Mr. Stone looked after the lady of the lake during the winter. There was people that had it only came in summer, and she used to talk about it being frozen up, you know, and they had to look after it. But anyway, she passed away 2 years ago, and she went in a home only just for a couple of months, as some told me, but she insisted that I have these family pictures of her and this service card of a funeral. Are very fond memories of Barbara. And then Maisie Rampling, have you ever heard such a name? But she was a friend of our evacuee, and she was in Leek. I kept hearing a lot of her, but apparently she stayed behind, and she married a chap named Doug Hamilton, and they just celebrated their 60 years marriage. She lives in Encroft, Leek. About 20 years after the war, probably about 1970, her mother was widowed, And the mother came up and they bought her a little house in West Street, Leek, about 3 doors from the Britannia pub. It was a friendly little pub, and I used to bob in from time to time. And Mrs. Rampling, she was very partial to Guinness. And when she'd had a few, she'd get the nearest customer to arm her back home, see that she got safely through the door. She's a lovely old Cockney lady, but Maisie Rampling's still living in Encroft today. And then, of course, Rushton had an evacuee called George Ellis and his sister, and they stayed with Arnold Turner, Mary Turner's mother and father. George they stayed during the war, and then in 1944 he was in the same class as me at Mount Sinai when he was 11, and then when the war ended he was 12 in 1945, and his mother sent word she was coming for him and his sister to take him back to Manchester. But he ran away. His mother came, his sister gathered his sister up, but George couldn't be found anywhere. And he waited till mother had gone, and then he told Mr. and Mrs. Turner, he says, could you plead with my mother that I could stop till I leave school, which is 2 years' time. We left at 14 then. And so they agreed, and he stayed till he was 14. And he kept in touch with the family. When Mrs. Turner died, I haven't seen him for a number of years, but he was more upset than Mary, the mother. He would, he'd really, and he wrote a little book with the help of his daughter, a little booklet, My Life as Evacuee in Rushton. And he's living in Lincolnshire now, but he's not too good. He has to travel about 20 miles to Boston for treatment. He's got problems. But I spoke to Mary on Sunday to make sure that he was still alive, and he is still alive, but he's not in great health, but he's 87, well, he's coming 87 like me. And then, of course, the Povies, Albert and David Povey, they were in Leek. Now, they stayed, I didn't know anything of them as evacuees, but as time went on, Albert Povey became a director of a mill in Leek. And he was a local councillor, and he produced dramatic plays, and he was a very good citizen of Leek. But Dave Povey, his brother, was quite more or less opposite. He wasn't much for public, but I got to know him ever so well, because I used to play darts against him, and he was a real character, he was. And his son, Steve, he came on the council, and he used to do a St. George's parade, and he set up an oat cake shop at Biddulph. And unfortunately Steve died when he was 53, but his son has taken over the oat cake. He's just moved to a large premises, and they produce the largest amount of oat cakes in Staffordshire, probably in the country. Moving on to more celebrities, there was on Country File, they recalled it last September, and Michael Aspel, he was evacuee at a little cottage in Devon, and they took him back to this cottage, and he took him to this small lake. He said, that's where I learned to swim. And he said he had a wonderful time there, and he was evacuee, and of course you know what, he came doing This Is Your Life and all sorts of things, and the other evacuee that was Derek Jameson. He came the editor of one of the national newspapers, and then after he gave that up, he did a programme on Radio 2 following Terry Wogan, and he used to say every morning, this is Jameson, the world's worst DJ. And it was quite funny really. But anyway, that's about the end of what I can recall evacuees over here. I was very happy to meet a lot and make friends with them, and their lives, they changed. It was Bill Badham to finish up a successful farmer, and Maisie Rampling finished up married and celebrating 60 years of marriage. So there must be something about North Staffordshire that's special. So anyway, thank you for listening.